Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today we're taking a brief pause from our series about how to fix democracy to talk about something that is related to that. This is a two-part conversation with the historian Robert Saunders as part of our occasional series with him, commemorating momentous events in British political history. We are going to be talking about something that happened 40 years ago this week, on the 1st of October 1985, at the Labour Party conference in Bournemouth. One of the most remarkable and one of the most significant speeches ever given by a British politician, Neil Kinnock, talking about Militant. We are going to be exploring the background to that speech, how it happened, why it mattered so much, and we're going to be explaining how it can make sense of the story of British politics from then right up to now.
Implausible promises don't win victories. I'll tell you what happens with impossible promises. You start with far-fetched resolutions. They are then pickled into a rigid dogma, a code. And you go through the years sticking to that, outdated, misplaced, irrelevant to the real needs, and you end in the grotesque chaos of a Labour council hiring taxis to scuttle round a city, handing out redundancy notices to its own workers.
Robert, that is probably the most famous extract from the speech that we're going to be talking about today, which is one of the most celebrated speeches in modern British political history. And we're going to be explaining the immediate context for what we've just heard, because not everyone will be familiar with it. Why was Neil Kinnock, the leader of the Labour Party, so incandescent with rage about a Labour council, Liverpool City Council, making its own workers redundant? And why did that become not just a flashpoint, but a turning point in the history of the Labour Party? But there is a longer story here too, and I really want to talk about that as well, try and understand it better. I hope you can help me understand it better. The group that Kinnock is talking about in that extract in this speech is usually referred to as the Militant Tendency, slightly weird name, Tendency. And later on in the speech, as we're going to hear more extracts, he calls them the Tendency Tacticians. Great alliteration. Usually they're known as Militant. They call themselves Militant. And I found myself just trying to look back through the history of Militant. When did it start? Where did it come from? And you very quickly, if you do that, get sucked into an extraordinary array of groups inside and outside the Labour Party on the, let's call it the far left. Militant, this version of Militant, was established in 1964. And I'm just going to take you through the list of what preceded it. So Militant came out of something called the Revolutionary Socialist League, which itself came out of something called the Revolutionary Communist Party, which had split three ways, including to create the Socialist Workers' Party. But one of the things it created was the thing that eventually became Militant. It was itself preceded by something called the Workers' International League, which was itself preceded by something called the Militant Group. And that takes us back to the 1930s. That takes us back to the period when to be a Trotskyite organization was to be in contact with Trotsky himself and to be part of the Fourth International. It's a long story, and there is real continuity in it because the militant group of the 1930s included among its leading lights a man called Ted Grant, a recent emigre from South Africa, who was the leading light in the militant that we are going to be talking about here in the 1980s. So over that near 50-year period. So my first question is really, to what extent is the thing that we're going to be talking about part of an ongoing semi-permanent struggle within the Labour Party between the mainstream party and various groups? If they had to be characterised, they have two distinguishing characteristics in that genealogy. There are variants, Trotskyite and what's called entryist, in the sense that these are not groups that are outside of the party, like the Communist Party of Great Britain. They are inside the Labour Party, trying to infiltrate various bits of the Labour organisation with either Trotskyite ideas or Trotskyite members. That's a very long way of saying, is what we're going to be talking about here part of a 50-year struggle or more?
Yes, it is. The crisis that explodes in the 1980s is really the final eruption of something that's been brewing ever since the 1930s, and which essentially centres on the question of whether the Labour Party can or should be a home to this alphabet soup of Trotskyite organisations that arrive in British politics. And the difficulty here is that the Labour Party has always been a kind of seething cauldron of different groups, factions, and tendencies. It contains within it trade unionists, middle-class intellectuals, Marxists, Fabians, anti-colonialists, social democrats, democratic socialists, and so on and so on. And that, of course, is one reason why the Labour Party is such a fractious party and why it's so difficult to govern. But it's also where its strength comes from. It's what gives it its intellectual vitality and it connects it to so many different streams of radical thought. Critics of Trotskyism would say that there are two things that make Trotskyist parties different. Firstly, these are essentially separate parties that seek to penetrate and manipulate parties of the left whose values and principles they do not share. And they do that through very tight and secretive organisations that take their orders from outside the party. And they often deny that those parties exist. So there are people that we know are active in the militant tendency who will swear blind that no such organisation exists. There is simply a newspaper here with which they are loosely associated. So this isn't like the Fabian Society or the Tribune Group, where you know who its leaders and its officers are. These are essentially secret organisations. And then the second thing that makes them different is that they are essentially revolutionary parties. They don't share the Labour Party's commitment to parliamentary democracy or to gradualism or to things like collective bargaining. Their purpose is to penetrate the Labour Party in order to gain recruits, build up their own networks, and crucially to build up class consciousness for the revolutionary struggle that is approaching. And they'll often do that by deliberately backing impossibilist proposals that are designed to demonstrate that you cannot succeed within the existing system. And that's the dilemma that ignites in the Labour Party in the 1930s and keeps burning until its final conflagration in the 1980s.
But in that attempt to infiltrate a movement whose values these Trotskyite organizations do not share, was there also a thought, even though they don't believe in democratic socialism as the route to social and class justice, the Labour Party by the 1930s has potentially become a party of government? There is at least the possibility that this party will win elections, and indeed there has been already by that point a Labour Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, though never yet a Labour majority government, but that was coming in 1945, and there would be another one in the 1960s. Is there, at least in part, the thought that when Labour is in power, to have infiltrated the party of power is not merely an opportunity to raise class consciousness, but actually to get close to the levers of power, or to get some people close to places within the British state where they can exercise influence in accordance with these ideas?
Yes, it is. So already from the 1930s, Trotskyist groups are looking beyond a Labour government. They're looking around them, and what they're seeing is a moment of revolutionary crisis. They're seeing capitalism in crisis after the Wall Street crash. They're seeing governments struggling to contain impossible levels of debt. They're looking at the rise of fascism, which Trotskyists have always seen as a product of late capitalism. And so they're not interested in what the next Labour government might do. They're interested in the revolutionary moment. But they work through the Labour Party for a reason, which is that the vehicle of the revolution is going to be the working class politicised and mobilised. And they recognise that the Labour Party is the primary political vehicle of the working class. So Trotsky himself in 1936 tells his supporters in Britain to work through the Labour Party, because that's where the living consciousness of the working class is. That's where you can find your recruits. But also, if you can take control of sections of this party, then it will itself become a vehicle of the revolution.
And how confrontational did it get? So we're going to be talking about a moment where it, as you say, it breaks out into the open. It becomes not just public, but actually does penetrate the consciousness of the workers. This becomes something that everybody is aware of. At earlier points in the history of the Labour Party, when it was being led by Clement Attlee, when it was being led by Harold Wilson, to what extent was this an irritant, and to what extent was this a serious threat to their ability to control and manage what became the party of government?
I think it's important to say that until the 1980s, these are always very small groups, and they struggle in periods when the Labour Party is doing well. They struggle in periods when parliamentary politics seems to be working, and when there is a sense of hope through the traditional instruments of the Labour Party, which are on the one hand the strike weapon, and on the other hand the parliamentary process. They really thrive at moments where, firstly, it looks like the capitalist system is breaking down, when there might actually be both a need and an opportunity for some kind of revolutionary crisis. But also moments when it looks like the Labour Party can't deliver that. So the 1930s is a key moment there, because this is a party that's been shattered in 1931 by the betrayal of its own leader, when it seems to be locked out of government, when the failure of the general strike has undermined the possibility of change through direct action. And it thrives again in the 1970s, when some of those conditions look like they're coming back into play again.
And yet in the 1970s, for the second half of that decade, there was a Labour government in power. It was a government that really struggled with parliamentary politics. It was not, for most of that period, one with a workable majority. And there was a lot of tension within the party at that time around the question of specifically Militant in this alphabet soup. It was by the 70s Militant that was the focus for this, for charges of entryism and the thought that various bits of the Labour organisation were at risk of being taken over. In the 1970s, some constituencies, always a fear that a constituency party might be captured by Militant, and then Militant would put a candidate in a safe seat, potentially, who would then be elected to Parliament. Also, I think the youth wing of the Labour Party was thought to be very vulnerable, young socialist organisations. And yet, the Labour Party did not choose the leadership to bring it to a head. There were attempts to expel Militant, and some senior Labour figures, including Tony Benn and Eric Heffer, who's going to feature later on in the story that we're discussing, though they weren't themselves Militant members, and indeed I think Militant were contemptuous of Benn by this point. I think they nicknamed him Kerensky. He was the sort of, he was the class traitor. Nonetheless, there was a concerted effort by some people on the left of the party at the top not to allow what they called a witch hunt. So why were the 70s different from the 80s in that respect? Was it partly because the party itself was further to the left, or there were more senior figures in the party that had a tradition on the edges of this kind of politics, who were willing to stand up and say the Labour Party is a broad church and it should include all of these groups? What changes from the 70s to the 80s?
I think the 70s is a really important hinge period here, because on the one hand, rather like in the 1930s, it looks like all of the ingredients are here for some kind of revolutionary crisis. You've got, again, a sense that capitalism is breaking down. You've had a 3-day week in industry. There are blackouts. Fascism seems to be resurgent again, with parties like the National Front building in many of Britain's cities, and a sense that a whole way of doing politics as well as economics is breaking down. But at the same time, you have a Labour government that looks like it wants to try to manage that crisis, or perhaps to ease that crisis, rather than actually seizing it. And the Labour government of 1974 to 79 comes to power on a really radical manifesto. It's got a tiny majority, but the manifesto is all about dramatic change. It promises an irreversible shift in wealth and power towards ordinary working people. And yet that government collapses in 1979 in what we might call the grotesque chaos of a massive strike by its own public sector workers. And that, I think, isn't just a political or electoral defeat. It's a massive intellectual shock to the party on the scale of 1931, because it looks like this is a party that has entirely lost its way. And I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that almost all of the new movements on the left in the 1980s, whether that's the militant surge, or whether it's the Bennite left, or whether it's the SDP breakaway, or whether it's Kinnock's project, or even the early stages of New Labour, in some ways all of those things are reactions against the catastrophe of 1979, and the sense that you need a new Labour with a lowercase n. You need something different to what this party has become by the end of its last time in power.
So I want to talk about some of those things that you just mentioned, because they precede the event that we're going to be talking about, a speech given in the middle of the 1980s, October the 1st, 1985. So one is the SDP breakaway. So as you said, the Labour Party had always been a very broad church, and it included people on the far left and people on what we might call the centre-right of the left. But in 1981, a group of those people split from the Labour Party and for a brief period looked like they might replace the Labour Party as the main opposition to the Conservatives. For people who remained in Labour, how vulnerable did that then leave them, with one of the sort of ballasts to the far left having removed themselves from the party, to being tipped in a far left direction? To what extent did the SDP breakaway leave, let's call them the centrists in the Labour movement, more vulnerable, more exposed to groups like Militant?
I think the SDP breakaway certainly leaves those who remain in the Labour Party, who are on the centre or the right, feeling deeply vulnerable. It also means that Tony Benn actually claims after the breakaway that he is now the legitimate deputy leader of the Labour Party, because although he had lost the deputy leadership contest, he argues that if it was recounted once the SDP had left, he would now in fact be their choice. But conversely, I think the breakaway actually mobilises those who remain to fight harder, because there is a sense now that you can't be passive or tolerant about the insurgency on the left. You recognise that this is now existential for the party. And I think the 1983 election in particular really reinforces and entrenches that.
So those events, the deputy leadership fight between Benn and Dennis Healey, which Healey very narrowly won, and won, in fact, mainly because of the support of the trade union movement. And it's interesting, the trade union movement's role in this is not to bolster the left, but to bolster the centre. The period managing the SDP breakaway and what it means for Labour politics, it happens under the leadership of Michael Foot, and Michael Foot leads the party into the 1983 general election and its cataclysmic defeat. 79 was traumatic, 83 was traumatic in a different way. Notoriously, the manifesto described by Roy Hattersley as the longest suicide note in history, a manifesto further to the left than those manifestos of the mid-70s, and rejected essentially by the British people, but also clearly splits the opposition to the Conservative Party. So the result of the 83 election is Margaret Thatcher is returned with a huge parliamentary majority, and Michael Foot stands down as Labour leader. He is to be replaced by Neil Kinnock, the man giving the speech we're talking about. What was Kinnock's pitch for the leadership of the Labour Party? Where did he stand in this? It was a sort of seething cauldron of, like you say, groups and tendencies and factions and traumas and historical memories. For different groups, what is the thing that they're trying to escape from, the moment of trauma they're trying to get away from? Where in all of that did Neil Kinnock stand?
I think the whole tone of Kinnock's leadership is set by the sense of existential crisis that's coursing through the party that he inherits in 1983. You mentioned the deputy leadership contest there. This is a contest that rips the guts out of the Labour Party for 6 months in 1981. For a post that has actually very few defined powers or duties, but it's not really about the deputy leadership. It's about the soul of the party and what direction it's going in the future. It's a sense that this is a party that hasn't won a decent election majority since 1966, whose last government has collapsed in rubble, which has just had the first major breakaway it's experienced since the 1930s. So that's still in the party's psyche, and it's absurdly close. I think Healey wins by 50.4% to 49.6%, and it exposes very painfully the rift between different sections of the party, because the constituency Labour parties vote by about 75% for Tony Benn, and the parliamentary party vote overwhelmingly for Dennis Healey. Then you layer on top of that the 1983 election. And I think in lots of ways, this is a bigger shock for the Labour Party than 1979, because you can make sense of losing in 79. The electoral pendulum has swung. Your government has ended in the winter of discontent. But now you've had 4 years of radical Thatcherism, unemployment is over 3 million. And Labour doesn't just lose, it loses by a landslide. It goes backwards on 1979. It wins 3 million fewer votes than it had the last time it went to the polls. It only just beats the Alliance into third place by about 2 percentage points in the vote. So it's a party that is politically divided, intellectually rudderless, and is watching its electorate simply wash away. And in lots of ways, Neil Kinnock looks like he might be the solution to that. He's young, he's charismatic, and he's dynamic in a party that started to look very old and stale and uninteresting. He's 30 years or so younger than people like Michael Foot or Jim Callaghan. He's nearly 20 years younger than Tony Benn. So he looks like he represents a new generation. I think he's actually the first Labour leader to have been born after the First World War, which is a mark of just how old Labour's leadership cohort had become. He's of the left, but he's not a Bennite. He's someone who actually had worked to prevent Tony Benn winning the deputy leadership in 1981. So the hope is that what you've got here is a new generation coming to power that's less scarred by some of the divisions of the past and that can begin the fight back that the Labour Party needs, not only if it's going to win the next election, but if it's going to survive as the main opposition party in Britain.
And just to be clear, when you say he's of the left, because this is one of those things I think people outside of the politics of the left, it's quite hard to place where these people stand, because we're going to be talking about a leader, Neil Kinnock, who is of the left of the Labour Party. Sometimes now, and we'll come on to this later in our conversation, it's called the soft left, but it's not the centre-right. You've got Bennites and Bennism, which is not militant, it's not Trotskyism, it's not communism, but it is further to the left. And then you have got these Trotskyite groups, these entryist infiltrators into the party, including, as we're about to discuss, in parts of the country, most notably in Liverpool, which are further to the left, if that's the right way to put it. I'm not sure if it is even a spectrum, than Tony Benn. So when we say Kinnock, when he came to office as leader of the Labour Party in 1983, was of the left of the party, what do we mean in that context? For instance, in policy terms or in rhetorical terms even. Did he talk about class still? Did he talk about nationalisation and public ownership? He was very closely associated with the campaign for nuclear disarmament. He was a unilateralist, which is a very important issue in the politics of the 1980s. Was that the marker that he was, he could be trusted by the left? What is it? What makes Kinnock a soft leftist?
So you make a really important point, which is that there is no such thing as the left in this period, in the sense of a cohesive group. The left is a space in British politics, which is itself bitterly and fiercely fought over between different factions. Now, Kinnock himself, I think, is a really interesting figure in this landscape because he's quite a complex blend of idealism and realism. So on the one hand, he has a really deep emotional commitment to Labour, to socialism, and to the trade union movement. This is a man who's grown up in a mining community. His father was a miner. His grandfather was a miner. He can sing you the songs of the Spanish Civil War. He's steeped in the history of things like Chartism. He's also probably the last great platform orator of British politics. And that's not just a kind of personal attribute. He really believes that you can remake the world through the power of ideas and by appealing to deep moral instincts that are burning in the hearts of the people. And throughout that Labour government of 1974 to 79, he's been a serial rebel. So he's somebody who he turns down advancement in the government. He opposes devolution to Scotland and Wales on socialist principles. He's an opponent of membership of the European Community on socialist principles. He wants a much more active state that is deeply involved in the economy and is promoting traditional industries like coal and steel. So we've got that side of Kinnock's character, but he's also got quite a cold, steely realism in him. And in a way that he talks about in the 1985 speech, he sees himself as the beneficiary of Labour in power. It really matters to Kinnock that Labour is a party of power, because he says every life chance he's ever had comes from Labour in power. that his parents had a decent house to live in, a council house provided by a Labour council, that he himself has had an education that has gone on as far as he wants to take it, that his family have had healthcare, that they've had life chances, that they've been treated as people of dignity. And Labour can only provide those things if it is in office. So I think alongside the idealism, there's also a bit of a contempt in Kinnock for what he sees as the kind of aristocratic dilettantism of somebody like Tony Benn, or for the kind of movements like Militant that want to circumvent the democratic process and do things to people rather than with them. So he's of the left, but he's someone who always wants to be in office and thinks that must be the primary goal of a Labour Party that is serious, not about compromising its principles, but about actually carrying out and delivering its principles in government.
So let's hear another clip from the speech which illustrates both of those things. Kinnock telling his story, but also, I think we really can say part of the greatness of this speech is in the delivery. And it's worth, if people want to, watching and listening to the whole thing. But here's just an example of how Kinnock uses his story to communicate exactly what you've just described there.
Because I owe this party everything I've got, not the job, not being leader of the Labour Party. I owe this party every life chance I've had from the time I was a child. A life chance, the life chance of a comfortable home with working parents, people who had jobs, a life chance of moving out of a pest and damp infested set of rooms into a decent home built by a Labour council under a Labour government. The life chance of an education that went on for as long as I wanted to take it. Me and millions of others of my generation got all their chances from this movement.
So we need to say more now, I think, about Militant, the other side of this argument, and particularly Militant in the city of Liverpool, because what brings this contest between Kinnock and what he stands for and the Militant tendency to a head is, first of all, the fact that Militant didn't just establish a foothold in Liverpool. Militant took over the city council and were running the city. And they were also to have one of the Liverpool members of Parliament, Terry Fields, a Militant member. First, two questions in a way here. How did Militant manage to succeed in Liverpool in a way that really does outstrip anything that was achieved in either other parts of the country or other parts of the movement? But also, we do need to explain the particular context here, which is this is about what was called at the time rate capping and the setting of an illegal budget. That is, the confrontation that Militant engineered was not with Kinnock. It was with the Thatcher government over the question of whether the Thatcher government could make it illegal for a council like the Liverpool City Council to spend more than the Thatcher government believed they were good for.
So Liverpool in the 1970s and 80s is on the front line of one of the most painful and traumatic shifts in the late 20th century, which is deindustrialization. So just as Britain has been the pioneer of the industrial revolution around the world, it's also the first advanced economy in which these industries are collapsing. So Liverpool had been one of the richest cities of the world in the 19th century. Its docks had handled some extraordinary percentage of global trade because it sits right at the heart of an entire imperial trading system. By the late 20th century, that has essentially collapsed. The engine of Liverpool's economy has broken down. And the result of that is massive levels of unemployment, really horrendous housing conditions and living conditions and urban dereliction and squalor. When Michael Heseltine goes to Liverpool in 1985, when he becomes the minister for Liverpool, he writes about looking at the River Mersey and how it's just an open sewer. So this is a city in terrible trouble. Its council is heading towards bankruptcy because its tax base is collapsing because of that economic decline. Its grant from central government is falling rapidly because the Thatcher governments are very keen on cutting costs. And because local government is itself a very large employer, because it's trying to take up the slack of the decline of industry, the danger here is that you get into a kind of economic and political death spiral. So there is an appetite in Liverpool far beyond Militant itself for really radical politics, which it hasn't had from the Labour Party traditionally, because Labour in Liverpool have been very much under the control of a small number of machine politicians who had actively tried to stop people joining and signing up in order to maintain their control. So it's a city that is open to the kind of radical politics that Militant offers, and also has a very decayed party that a group like Militant can itself penetrate and try to take over. I think it's important to say that this is a very different council to some of the other radical Labour councils of the period. It's not like the GLC under Ken Livingstone or Sheffield under David Blunkett. Livingstone in particular is very keen to re-anchor the Labour Party in what are called the new social movements, to build a kind of rainbow alliance of organisations and movements dedicated to things like feminism or gay rights or black civic rights or Irish republicanism to extend the Labour Party's traditional base. Militant is not interested in that. It regards all of those things as distractions from the class war. Derek Hatton, who's its leading figure in Liverpool, actually talks in the same kind of language as The Sun about the loony left and people who want to call manhole covers personhole covers. So it's very much focused on the class struggle, and its central policy programme in Liverpool is a massive programme of house building, which it argues is going to create jobs, is going to provide better housing, but is also going to bring it into collision with government because it doesn't actually have the money to pay for these things.
And Hatton, who you mentioned there, who became the figurehead for Militant and the target, the primary target of Kinnock's speech, is also of Kinnock's generation. I think it's important here that he was younger than Neil Kinnock. He is younger than Neil Kinnock. Kinnock in his 40s at this point, Hatton, I think, still in his late 30s, and in some ways looking younger, actually. One of the things about Derek Hatton is he looked like, at various points, an angry student. The confrontation, though, as I said, that Militant were trying to engineer was not primarily with the leadership of the Labour Party. It was with the Thatcher government. And it touches on that thing you mentioned at the start of our conversation. One of the characteristics of this form of politics is to engineer the event that will reveal to the workers, reveal to the working class, what is at stake in the struggle. And in this case, it was to confront the Thatcher government's rate capping agenda, rate capping legislation, which forbade councils from spending more than they were able to take in, trying to get them to balance their books. But the way that Militant chose to do this, and this is the immediate context for that clip that we heard at the beginning about a Labour council, sending redundancy notices to its workers around the city by taxi, is Militant made council workers redundant in order to illustrate to the workers that this is what the Thatcher government was doing to the city of Liverpool by rate capping. And I think all of the people involved on the Militant side concluded afterwards that that was a strategic mistake, because it is a complicated argument to make, because as Kinnock exploited in his speech, it wasn't the Thatcher government that was making these workers redundant. It was Liverpool City Council run by Militant. It was the council, a Labour council, firing its own workers. How did they get themselves into that position? Is this just a classic example of that Trotskyite belief that, in a way, as long as the confrontation is big enough and the symbolism is real, the capitalists will get the blame?
Well, it's sometimes said in politics that there is nothing more dangerous than an early victory. And I think it's important to stress that what Militant is doing for the first year actually seems to be working. So the idea here is that you're offering the people of Liverpool hope. You're offering them house building and employment. And I think it's unquestionable, however critical one might be of Militant, that they have very wide support in the early years for what they're trying to do. And they're essentially challenging the Thatcher government to either bail them out or let them go bankrupt. And in a sense, for Militant, both of those outcomes are fine. Because if the Thatcher government bails you out, then you've shown the power of the people. You've shown that resistance and defiance actually works. You've built revolutionary consciousness. If they force you into bankruptcy, then you've shown that the system is broken and that you can't actually solve Liverpool's problems without really fundamental political change. Now, in 1984, the Thatcher government is, of course, locked in combat with the miners. It's facing the biggest strike really since the 1930s. And so it can't open another front with Liverpool. So in 1984, actually, the government does bend and it gives Liverpool a higher settlement. So Militant wins in 1984. It then tries to run that again in 1985. But of course, by then, the miners have been defeated. This time, the Thatcher government is ready to fight. This time, the councillors are what are called surcharged. Commissioners are sent in. It's clear that Liverpool isn't going to get the extra money. So to try to push the crisis further on, the council takes the decision that it has to issue redundancy notices to 30,000 of its own workers. And famously, as Kinnock says, they're sent around in taxis. And the reason for that is that the public sector unions in Liverpool will not deliver these notices. They rebel. So it's a crucial moment, actually, in separating Militant and the council from trade unions in Liverpool, who will not support a council that is actually making their own members redundant. So it's a catastrophic strategic error. And that is what gives Kinnock the opening for his conference speech in 1985. And he tells the story, I don't know whether it's been romanticised or not, that he hears of this decision to send out redundancy notices at a railway station. And he says to the person he's with, "I've got them."
I want to ask you about the miners' strike, because that is also part of the context for this speech. That had been, in a different part of the labour movement or the workers' movement, another attempt to, in a way, engineer the confrontation which will make the stakes clear. Scargill, the National Union of Mine Workers, were going to take on the government in a series of confrontations which will force people to take sides. That's part of what's going on here. And that defeat, presumably, is also a big part of the subtext of Kinnock's speech when he talks about rigid dogma, people engineering positions, engineering confrontations, symbolic contests, rather than focusing on the matter at hand, which is essentially winning elections and delivering for the working people of Britain. But Scargill's defeat, it doesn't just give Thatcher her opportunity to take on Militant. It does also presumably give Kinnock his opportunity to take on Militant, because in a way, this argument has already been run and already failed on a much bigger scale than Liverpool City Council. The defeat of the miners was a bigger defeat than anything that was going to happen in Liverpool, but it is a version of the same argument, and Kinnock is making the same argument about these two events.
Yes, the miners' strike is the iconic struggle of the 1980s. It pits the most powerful government of modern times against the most powerful trade union of its day, and it becomes actually a rallying point for a much wider range of forces. So famously, you get gay rights activists, black rights activists, feminist groups mobilising behind the miners because they see this as the moment at which the fate of the Thatcher government is going to be decided. But for Neil Kinnock, it's absolutely devastating. It wrecks the first year of his leadership. And it's personally deeply traumatic for him. As I said, his father is a miner, his grandfather was a miner. He's got family members and childhood friends who are standing on the picket lines. His constituency is part of the South Welsh coalfield. And I think he still believes today that coal had a great future as an engine of the British economy, that this was an industry that a sane government would be expanding and investing in, not running into the ground. So all of his emotions and all of his personal sympathies are with the miners. But he also believes that Arthur Scargill, the president of the NUM, with whom he has utterly poisonous relations, is leading the miners to absolutely certain defeat. He thinks the failure to hold a national ballot is a catastrophic error. He's appalled at the violence on the picket lines by the police, but also by some of the pickets themselves. And that means that he can't either support the strike wholeheartedly or condemn the strike. He's just kind of beached in no man's land, getting machine guns by both sides. And so that wrecks a lot of the relationships on which he had hoped to build a Labour revival after 1983. But I think it also means that when the strike ends in 1985, what you have is a wounded, bloodied and slightly toughened Kinnock, who now is ready to launch the fight back, who sees this as a crucial moment at which he has to retake the initiative from Arthur Scargill and from Militant, and he's going to use his speech to do that.
I'm old enough to remember this speech, and it is one of those rare speeches that did cut through, as people say now. It entered public consciousness. People were aware of it. It got very wide coverage and comment on TV, in newspapers. A very rare party conference speech that became iconic. And there is a almost conventional wisdom in British politics that party conference speeches are now given not for the people in the hall, but for a wider audience, that you've got to speak beyond the hall because the people in the hall are frankly not representative of the British public. They are party members. Increasingly in British politics, a narrower and narrower group of people. Not true actually in the 70s and 80s so much. But you are projecting beyond the hall to a wider audience, television audience, a national audience. And Kinnock achieved that. But to me, what's so striking about this speech, looking back at it now, is that it exists in the hall. It is a very, very charged atmosphere. And he doesn't by any means get it all his own way. I want to play another clip, partly because actually it illustrates many of the themes that you've talked about, including, I love the line about these people being just another bunch of public schoolboys wanting to live by Rudyard Kipling. But you can hear in this clip the range of responses to what Kinnock is saying. There was real booing, and we'll talk a bit about how various figures in the hall reacted, but it was a fraught occasion.
I'm telling you, you can't play politics with people's jobs and with people's services. The voice of the people, not the people here, the voice of the real people with real needs is louder than all the boos that can be assembled. Understand that, please, comrades, in your socialism, in your commitment to those people. Understand it. The people will not, cannot abide posturing. They can't respect the gestured generals or the tendency tacticians. Comrades, it seems to me lately that some of our number become like sort of latter-day public school boys. It seems it matters not whether you won or lost, but how you played the game. We can't take that inspiration from Rudyard Kipling.
Do we have any sense of how risky this was in the hall itself? He was confronting a part of the Labour movement, which was itself narrow, militant, but had quite a lot of support. So notoriously, the leading Labour figure, Eric Heffer, an MP for a Liverpool constituency, not a member of Militant, but sympathetic to Militant, one of the people who had defended Militant from the so-called witch hunt in the 1970s. Heffer walked out of Kinnock's speech. Derek Hatton was standing in the back of the room, red with rage. I mean, if Kinnock is angry, Hatton looks even angrier. There's a great little clip of Michael Foot sitting in the middle of this packed room with a look of almost amusement on his face, like he's seen all of this before. I mean, just looking around him, sort of taking it all in, also, in a way, enjoying the moment. How big a risk was Kinnock running in the room, do you think? How sure was he that he had, I think you can hear in that clip, the majority of the members in the room on his side, but how sure do you think he was that he would win this fight in the room?
I think he knows it's a risk, but I think he also knows that the nature of risks is that the payoff, if you win them, is extraordinarily high. And as we've heard in that clip, and as people will see if they watch any of the clips on YouTube, this is sensational television. There's something almost pugilistic about this quite big guy on the platform making his case, Eric Heffer marching off the platform in disgust, people standing up and booing and jeering, other people standing up and shouting and clapping. There's an incredible release of energy here. And I think we should remember that Kinnock is still just about of a generation that was actually used to quite rumbustious platform politics, in which heckling was a normal part of political life, and in which you learn through speaking in constituencies, at mining meetings, at trade union lodges, you learn to deal with that kind of backfire in a way that's completely alien to politics nowadays. And I think he knows that, firstly, there is a large section of the party that is hungry for this to end. There are people in the hall who are sick of the fact that when the most radical right-wing government of their lifetimes is rewriting the rule book of British politics, the Labour Party is turning in on itself, and it actually wants someone to lead them out of that. But Kinnock also knows that the footage of him fighting his own party, or fighting the radical elements in his own party, is going to play very well with people who are not in that party and who are suspicious of the Labour left. You said just now, I think rightly, that we don't remember very many conference speeches. The ones that we do tend to be where a leader is challenging their own party. It's Hugh Gateskill standing up and saying, I will fight and fight and fight again to save the party I love. Or it's, in a more low-key way, it's Margaret Thatcher taking on the wets in her party and saying, you turn if you want to, the lady's not for turning. And Kinnock knows that this is for TV. There's a moment in there where he urges the conference to remember the people. He says, not the people in this hall, the real people outside. He knows there is a difference between the activist and the ordinary voter, and that you've got to be focused upon them.
Kinnock did get a reputation. He may already have had it in 1985 as a windy speaker. One of his nicknames was the Welsh windbag. There was going to be a moment not that long after this in 1986 in the parliamentary debate over what was called the Westland affair, where his prolix tendency was thought actually to have cost him the opportunity potentially, and Margaret Thatcher thought this herself, to unseat her. Maybe it was slightly exaggerated in hindsight, but she believed that she went into the Commons not certain she would come out secure as Prime Minister, and Kinnock let her off the hook with his windy ways. But this speech is so magnificent. I mean, really, I don't think I'm exaggerating to say to watch it, it's still electrifying. Apparently, he stuck quite closely to the script. A script was handed out to journalists, and they were able to say that he didn't, little deviations, but not much. It was disciplined. And it was really charged with anger, an authentic anger. It has that priceless quality in politics, which is authenticity, which sometimes when Kinnock went on, it sounded a little bit like he was in love with the rhetoric at the expense of the authentic argument he was trying to get across. But it's one of those perfect combinations of content and delivery. I think it's fair to say he never matched it again.
I think it's his finest moment rhetorically. In lots of ways, he's quite a transitional figure in the history of rhetoric, because there's a reason why Kinnock tends to say everything 3 times. And that's partly because he comes out of a tradition where you're standing on platforms with very loud, boisterous crowds. And so you repeat yourself because you may not have been heard the first time. So actually, when we look back at the rhetoric of somebody like a Mr. Gladstone in the 19th century, you could never get away with that nowadays. You'll be regarded as hopelessly prolix, but it's how they've learnt their rhetorical style. I think it's also true to say that there is quite a smart tactical operation that goes on within the Conservative Party, which is that a long-standing political saw is that you take your opponent's strengths and you turn them into weaknesses. So you recognise that Kinnock is a very good orator and you make his oratory the problem. So you constantly push the line that he's just all about words, he's just a windbag, he's just someone who rambles on. And I think that gets under his skin, actually, and in a funny way, it brings out that tendency in himself because he becomes more self-conscious and more nervous about his speaking. But you're right that this speech is Kinnock at his most disciplined because he knows that this is a pivotal moment in his leadership, but also, he believes, in the whole future direction of his party.
And it's partly pivotal, to go back to something we were discussing earlier, because in the 1980s, the opposition to the Thatcher government on the broad left, understood in the broadest terms, is split. And the victories that Margaret Thatcher wins, particularly in 1983, but also in 1987, are achieved on a share of the vote, which give her a very large majority in the Commons because the opposition is split. The SDP didn't break through in the way it had hoped. In 1983, it's in alliance with the Liberal Party, but it is still a serious threat to the Labour Party. And there is a fight going on to become the unified opposition to conservatism. The Conservatives are united. They are not facing a threat further to their right, nor further to their left within their own movement, and they are united behind their leader. So this is, among other things, an existential struggle under a first-past-the-post system to be the party of opposition. And in that sense, it was a triumph. I mean, it's not the only thing that happened, and it's not the only reason why it happened, but it is, I think, possible to trace from here to the next Labour government, which is going to come in 1997, because the first step on that road has to be to ensure that Labour is where voters go when they have finally had enough of the Conservative Party. And this seems to me was a significant step on that road.
Yes, So the opposition, as you say, is split between two parties, but I think it's also split in a more fundamental sense, in that it's split over the question of how do you defeat Thatcherism? What are actually the appropriate methods that you should use to do so? Are you going to defeat it through the parliamentary struggle? Or are you going to defeat it through direct action and trade union activity? Or are you going to defeat it through consciousness building, which isn't just a kind of Trotskyite concern? Famously, Tony Benn says that the 1983 election defeat is a triumph because although Labour has lost, 8 million people have voted for a genuinely socialist party, and that is a platform on which you can build. And you didn't win that time. You might not win next time, but the time after that you'll win. And then this won't be 1974 again. This will be a genuinely transformative socialist government. So the battle for Kinnock isn't just to defeat the alliance, it's also to reassert the primacy of the parliamentary route to power. And actually that's mostly what the 1985 speech is about. It's mostly about the democratic route to power. Now, in some ways, the obstacles to that are already clearing. The defeat of the miners' strike has undermined the idea that you can bring the Thatcher government down by direct trade union action. He's making the case in this speech that we can't just be building a movement for the future. We've got to be winning now because the people who depend upon the Labour Party depend upon Labour being in office sooner rather than later. So it's part of a continuing argument about what is the Labour Party for and how do you bring what he would regard as the dark night of Thatcherism to an end.
So I want to ask you about the two paths out of this speech. This is a confrontation between Neil Kinnock and what he stands for in the Labour movement, and Derek Hatton, Militant in Liverpool, and what that group stands for in the Labour movement. Kinnock wins, but he partly wins because Militant have already lost. As you say, they made, and they recognised it, a grave error in their strategy in this confrontation with the Thatcher government. So a question I'm going to ask you in a second is from here to New Labour, but there's another, you might almost say, ironic path out of this, because Militant did not collapse in Liverpool by any means. The council remained popular, and within the city, Labour dominated in various parts of the movement within the city by Militant, put on votes through various local and national elections, including in 1987. Liverpool does remain in some ways a case apart in the Labour story, but Militant never achieved the prominence after this speech that they had before it. But the militant movement was involved in the direct action struggle that you could say did bring down Margaret Thatcher, because Militant helped to organise the protests against the poll tax. And though the community charge, as the Conservatives wanted to call it, but it became known as the poll tax, including violent confrontations that took place in 1990, that wasn't by any means the sole or sufficient condition of the fall of Margaret Thatcher, but it played into a feeling in the Conservative Party that Thatcher herself had run out of road. It didn't lead to a victory in 1992 under Kinnock, but nonetheless, one of the ironies of this is that there was a direct action movement in British politics at the end of the 1980s, which did have a powerful effect on the course of British politics. And Militant, for all of the fact it was fringe by that point, was part of it.
I'd have to say I'm very sceptical about that, to be honest.
So just to be clear, are you sceptical that Militant were part of it, or that the poll tax riots, as they were called, were part of the reason for the downfall of Margaret Thatcher?
I'm sceptical that the poll tax riots contributes significantly to bringing down Margaret Thatcher. Now, that's certainly the story that Militant would like to tell, that in fact they are vindicated, that they bring Margaret Thatcher down in a way that Kinnock cannot do. I'm afraid I just don't believe that. Riots very rarely bring governments down. We've seen significant civic violence in Britain in 2010, 2011, for example. Last summer, the Thatcher government had endured much worse during the miners' strike, during the Brixton riots, during the Toxteth riots. What brings Margaret Thatcher down, I think, is that Conservative MPs are looking at electoral oblivion. They can read the polls. They're hemorrhaging support, partly because of the poll tax, also because of other concerns at the time. The poll tax is spectacularly unpopular, and the London riots illustrate that. But I don't think that that is the weapon that is used to remove Margaret Thatcher. They're hemorrhaging safe Conservative seats at by-elections. And I think it's that, and the sense that there is a Labour Party that the public are willing to see in power that really does for Margaret Thatcher, not the violent actions in Trafalgar Square.
I mean, in a way, I agree. I don't think I was trying to say that those riots were the trigger. But in a way, the irony, and I do think it is an irony, which is, as you just suggested there, they did have some symbolic significance. And Militant is the movement of symbolic politics, in a way, of sort of showcase politics, the great event that will capture a moment or a mood. And absent all the other things that were going on, a Thatcher government could have ridden out those riots. But with all the other things that were going on, it did much more than the many riots that happened during the Thatcher years, going back to the Toxteth riots or the Brixton riots, which lie behind this period of politics that we've been talking about. At the fag end of the Thatcher years, in the dying period, a moment like that did have a symbolic value, which it wouldn't have had at other points. I don't, any more than you do, think that Militant brought down Margaret Thatcher, but I can see why they believed that there are rare moments in politics where the symbolic event does have a force that can have a real effect.
We might have to agree to disagree on 1990, but I do agree that the importance of Militant is always largely symbolic. It's not principally what Militant is doing in Liverpool that is the big problem for the Labour Party nationally. The problem is that the Conservative Party and the right-wing press can point at Militant and say that this is what the Labour Party really is, and that these are the people who are really pulling the strings behind the scenes, in the same way that Derek Hatton is not the leader of Liverpool Council, but everybody knows that he is the most important person in that council. The claim is that behind Kinnock, there are all these other people who are much more dangerous and who would pull his strings in government. It's so much harder to make that argument after Kinnock's speech in 1985, when you have this iconic footage of Militant yelling, faces puce with rage at Neil Kinnock as he attacks the grotesque chaos of their management of Liverpool. And that's where I think this speech is so important symbolically, in that it breaks that ability realistically to link the Labour leadership to the kind of politics that people can see in militant councils.
Is there a line from here to New Labour? So one of the things, I think it's not much more than coincidence, but something else that happens in 1985 is that Peter Mandelson, who is a thread running through the Labour story from that year to this year, because he's just been fired as Britain's ambassador to the United States, causing serious problems for the current Labour government. The 40 years that follow, they're not the Mandelson years, but Mandelson is a thread running through Labour politics and the history of the Labour Party over this period. And it starts in 85, and he comes into the Labour Party to help rebrand it. And the rebranding is going to take a long time, and it's going to accelerate much more rapidly under Tony Blair. But is there a line, do you think, from this moment and this speech to what would happen in 1997, which is a thumping victory at the polls, a huge parliamentary majority for the Labour Party? The thing that Neil Kinnock says in this speech, the Labour movement should prioritise above all else. The real needs, as he calls them, can only be served by really, actually winning elections. Can you get from this speech to Blair's triumph in 97?
I think there is a line, though, as so often, I think it's probably a jagged line with lots of strange quirks and corners in it, because in all sorts of ways, Neil Kinnock and Tony Blair are fundamentally different people, and their politics are very different. Neil Kinnock would still call himself a democratic socialist. Blair, I think, would not accept that term, certainly today. And actually, the people who built New Labour were often very critical of Neil Kinnock. The irony is that New Labour is, of course, always associated with being obsessed with presentation and with spin, and that's why Peter Mandelson is such an iconic figure. But Blairites often argued that it was actually Kinnock that was all about presentation, that it was Kinnock who thought that you could essentially keep the same policies, but if you packaged them better, if you had a red rose and you changed the design on the conference backgrounds, then people might vote for it. Whereas the Blairites really are interested in changing the policy and changing what Labour actually wants to do in government. But where I think there is a lineage is in the sense that they both shared a sense that Labour must have absolutely no truck with revolutionary parties that rejects the democratic process. They both agree that if Labour is going to help people who are poor, who are hungry, who are in need, then it has to win the votes of people who are not poor, who are not hungry, and who are not in need. And therefore the Labour Party while retaining its traditional support base, must reach out to middle-class voters who are prospering under Thatcherism, as well as those who are being crushed by it. They both recognise that it can be to their advantage to be seen to be fighting the left in their party. And they both thought that Labour needed an absolutely laser-like focus on winning power. And it had to have that focus not as a trade-off against its idealism, but as the thing that made it possible to deliver on its ideals. So I think Kinnock and his speech and the Kinnock project more broadly makes New Labour possible, though I don't think it makes it inevitable.
In our next episode, Robert and I are going to be continuing this conversation and taking the story right up to the present day. So we are going to be going from Militant to Momentum, from Kinnock to Corbyn to Starmer. We're going to be talking about what all this means for the Labour government in power now, and also what it means for the Democratic Party and the dilemmas it's facing in the United States. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.